right. Well, thank you all for joining us. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to welcome everyone and thank you for tuning in to this week's town hall, where we will cover the immediate challenges posed to the public transportation by COVID-19 pandemic, measuring the effectiveness of transportation, the amount of people who've been still being able to use it, equity, and the changing trends, projections, in the future of transportation. So first, I wanted to welcome Keith Benjamin. He is the director of the Department of Traffic and Transportation in the city of Charleston in South Carolina. He's an alumni. He went to Ethiopia and Kenya in 2019. We have David Spector. He's the Director of Infrastructure Advisory for KPMG. He went to Vietnam and Malaysia in 2017. And we have the Honorable Vince Fong. He's a member of the California State Assembly. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
So Keith, I want to turn it over to you. Give us a brief introduction about your position and what it covers.
Well, first of all, thank y'all. It's always good. I feel like saying family because the type of trips that we have with ACYPL let you leave as family. And I was talking with our cohort yesterday. We're still on our WhatsApp chat, letting them know. And so, hi, family. It's good to be here. Again, my name is Keith Benjamin. I'm the head of transportation for the city of Charleston, South Carolina. The mayor has also asked me to be his representative on our Carter Transit Authority, our Aviation Authority, and also our Tri-County Council of Governments, which is our MPO. And so privileged to be able to touch the full breadth of transportation, not just here in the Charleston region, but in our state, and really get a chance to dig into what's a passion of mine, and that's building the bridges between opportunity and access, and ensuring that no matter who a person is or what mode of transportation they use in the public right-of-way, that they're safe and they have the accessibility that they need. And so glad to be part of this conversation, glad to have the opportunity to have this exchange and talk about how our cities and states and what's happening federally is moving the needle around mobility.
Thank you. I'll lead it over to you, Honorable Vince Fong. So for your sector, what district do you cover in California? And I believe you sit on the Transportation Committee. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you all for allowing me to join you today. Very familiar with this organization. A lot of friends of mine that have traveled and are alumni of ACYPL. So I am the vice chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee. I represent the 34th Assembly District in California, which is the Kern County area of the Central Valley. So if you fold California in half, we're pretty right there in the middle. And so we're known for our agriculture and energy production, but we also are known for aerospace. So when we talk about transportation, if you come to California, you probably have heard of the 99 and the 5, the major freeways that go north-south. But then we have the 58 that goes east-west. And so we're a major trade corridor in terms of trucking and just moving goods and services throughout the state of California. So when it comes to transportation, we cover it all. As a state, California is certainly making news in the transportation sector. But from my perspective on the Transportation Committee, we're trying to fix the basics, the roads, the bridges, the highways, the airports, the ports, but then also planning for the future. So what is going to happen in transportation in the next 30 to 40 years? As an elected official, that's the one thing that's always our challenge, is looking out to the future. But there's so much technological advancement in transportation. So every 2 to 3 years, something's happening. And so all our plans pretty much have to be reevaluated. So that's a big challenge for us. And I'm happy to continue the conversation in any specific areas that folks want to talk about.
Thank you. And David, you're the only one in the panel who represents a private sector. So how does that play into the United States transportation? And what kind of work do you do with your clientele?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So I work for KPMG. I'm a director in our infrastructure advisory practice. We advise public sector clients on infrastructure projects and strategy, transportation across sectors. And so I come from the public sector. I used to run the state of Colorado's high performance transportation enterprise. That was our entity that did innovative alternative delivery type projects, large scale, innovative funding. And at KPMG, I do a lot of the same type of work, but for clients across the country. So my clients include transportation agencies and transit agencies and state governments and local governments on everything from a large rail project in California to an automated fare collection system on the East Coast. One of my clients right now is putting together a connected and automated vehicle testing facility, right, for all the new technologies that are coming out there. And then helping a lot of clients right now in COVID recovery. As Assemblyman and Fong mentioned, the pace of change is quick, and that's the technology change. But when you think about the unexpected changes, right, like things that weather that Keith has to deal with right now, or the pandemic, and how that changes travel patterns and our how we all use mobility, that's a lot of what we're focused on. So we help our clients think through that, all from the public sector perspective. So I'm excited to be here today. I did join my cohort in Vietnam and Malaysia in 2017, which was a great trip. And the fascinating thing about wherever you go in the world with ACYPL is mobility is critical, right? Whether you're in a city where everybody's getting around on two-stroke mopeds, or whether you're in a city like Kuala Lumpur that's building a high-speed rail project, mobility, transportation, and transit is what connects us all. So looking forward to the conversation today with you and Keith and Assemblyman Fong.
Thank you so much. So let's just get started. I really want this to be a conversation amongst us all. So for all of us out there, what does transportation mean? So I know it's roads, bridges, and for many places that mean high-speed rails, like an Amtrak, or it could be like a metro station in DC or a subway in New York City. What else does your sector cover?
Well, I'll jump in there, and I think it's easy to get into the technical of transportation, but I think I'm going to take the philosophical route a little bit. In my view, transportation, obviously we're biased in this convo, but I do believe transportation is the common denominator for how we build communities. And that, in fact, it's the wheel in the middle of the wheel of some of the answers to the varying different issues that occur in our communities. Accessibility is a major part of how people deal with their health, how people deal with their education, how people deal with safety in their community, how people get to be able to deal with workforce. But sometimes that transportation ends up on the back burner or an afterthought in that. I do believe that if we get transportation right, we begin to get some of those other issues right as well. And so our context around transportation being an answer at the intersections, I think is a key factor. And that to me is a newer thought process that's developed over the last decade or so, where historically it has just been about brick and mortar. How are we paving the road? How are we fixing the bridges and otherwise? And those pieces are vitally important aspects, but the context and how we discuss it, who we discuss it with, right? How we've expanded the tent to talk about the importance of transportation and the everyday building of community, I think is important. And I think that's a critical factor that's going to be an opportunity as we come out of the pandemic and talk about how our communities function for the future.
Well, just to follow up on what Keith said, I mean, transportation is how we move people and families and goods and products around. But tied to what was mentioned earlier by Keith, it is tied to our quality of life, right? So traffic congestion, airport delays if you're traveling. Now it's linked to housing. How we get around is impacted by how far we live from our work and from each other. It's also tied to our economy, right? If we go to the store, we expect goods and services or goods and products there, and how do we get that there? Do we do it by ship? Do we do it by plane? Do we by rail? With when we order something on Amazon, we want our something there within a day or two. So transportation is kind of the foundation of just how we move things around and how we move around ourselves. But we take it for granted because if everything goes smoothly, it's great. But when something doesn't happen as well, then we get frustrated, and it's a clear indicator of our quality of life in our communities. So potholes, delays, things like that are frustrating things that we reflect on as individuals.
Certainly.
Yeah, I think it was said well by both you guys. I think the only thing I would add is that when you're talking about transportation, what it means, we think that definition evolves, right? I mean, Assemblyman Fong, you mentioned, going to the store. Well, now the store comes to me, right? I get on my app and I get a delivery of groceries. And 10 years ago, people would have said you're crazy if you were going to use the internet to find a stranger to then drive you to somewhere you wanted to go, right? 5 years ago, everybody's using Uber and Lyft all over the place, and they would have said you were crazy if everybody was going to stop using Uber and Lyft because of a health crisis, right? I think that it changes so dynamically that all of these factors are interrelated, and I think what this discussion shows is that it isn't just about getting from here to there, right? It's about the system, the processes, the technology, and the people that make it all work together.
And actually, there's a workforce issue too, because at some point, what's being delivered to your house may not be driven to you by an individual. It might be a driverless car. It might be a drone. So there's that issue too. There's a labor and workforce issue as well.
Yeah.
So as we look at, as you mentioned, the concerns and what we thought was realistic prior to COVID, do you see any similarities in some of the challenges pre-COVID and while we're, even still in COVID? What are some of the inequities that you see, and what are some of the large issues that are either the same or are vastly different? Like David mentioned, the conundrum when it comes to ordering things online or even Uber.
Well, I'll just say that as someone who is trying to navigate our communities and the state through this pandemic on transportation, it's a real challenge because it changes the behavior of. COVID and the pandemic changed how people react and how people travel. So, we're telling people not to get together, not to congregate. Well, that affects people getting on a bus or on a train. How does that work? And will that behavior change as we move forward? Of course, the pandemic has affected rural communities a little differently than urban communities because of housing density and those transit hubs. So how people get around has been impacted too. And of course, people weren't traveling by plane or maybe they were taking the precautions and they were driving more and not flying or not not taking public transit. And so those are really interesting dynamics from just a behavior standpoint. And now I don't know we've gotten through it just yet. So it's going to be interesting to see whether everyone reverts back to their old behavior or whether the pandemic has changed our travel behavior permanently.
Yeah, I think just three things for us that came. I'll keep it local. One of the things for us that was a little bit different than probably some other major municipalities. The bulk of our fixed route transit system has been held afloat by essentially our essential workforce. Right. In my city, the vast majority of our transit riders make 45,000 or less. Vast majority are of color. Vast majority don't own a car, and so the same constituency that was keeping us moving was also the same constituency we still had to figure out how to serve. In fact, there was one route that we actually our board had taken away because we were minimizing some of the transit routes and much of what many transit agencies were having to do to kind of tighten the belts, and had to make a correction because that specific route connected one of our communities. It was the only connection to the grocery store that they used. So we had to bring it right back on because of the folk that were being served. And so I think that was a piece that was the factor. We're in the midst of building a $400 million bus rapid transit system that's going to connect 3 different municipalities. That's going to expand from just dependent riders to choice riders as well. And so we're excited about that. But in the core aspect of getting people from point A to point B, that essential workforce ended up meaning making sure our transit was staying afloat. The other piece was that as a city that ranks at the top around tourism, our small businesses played a big role. Whereas pre-COVID, some of the things that we in placemaking and in transportation and planning and engineering would love to see innovatively done on our public right-of-ways and in our public sphere, all of a sudden became attractive. So whereas before COVID, it was about how many parking spaces could you keep. Now it was how do you create distance, and all of a sudden blocking certain streets for people to be able to socially distance and eat out in the open, or being able to create more areas of green space that folk could utilize in ways and still keep some level of life while they were trying to navigate this pandemic, became attractive because it became attractive to the business community. And so some of the parklets we've been able to do, some of the open space work, some of the variances we've done within our zoning code about how our right of ways are used in support of restaurants and hotels and all these different type of places, that door became open. And it's going to be interesting to see if it's just an immediate snap back to what it used to be, or folk begin to see that that actually makes sense, and that quite frankly, it assists with the bottom line. I think the other piece that was interesting for us was that though they're definitely from a operational and personnel standpoint, municipalities all over the country had to really tighten the belts and make some specific decisions. I'll say for us down in the Southeast area, work was still going on. Right. I just got the text message while we were sitting here. We just finished our first protected bike lane in city history. We were on the phone yesterday about a 526 highway extension with the state DOT. Mentioned the bus rapid transit system. We have to get that project into FTA for the New Starts grant by September. We're building a $18 million bike ped bridge, and that construction contract has to go out this fall. And so some of the work around getting the infrastructure done still was going. And that's really a credit to a lot of our varying municipalities and agency staff who we had to make sure we're protected, but still we're moving the needle. So just wanted to give some localized perspective on that.
Thank you. So as you look at budgets, because I know you say ridership is down in many places, for instance, in Washington, D.C., I'm an avid metro and bus user. And so I've even, stopped using the bus and the metro. And I've noticed that in my area, a lot of the local or regular buses are no longer available. So how do you continue to do such large projects and programs if your ridership is down? How have the budgets fluctuated within your municipalities or even with your clients, David?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. And transit agencies, I think in particular, as opposed to maybe state departments of transportation, are critically impacted. I mean, pre-COVID, they were facing a crisis of how do you deal with this competition from Ubers and Lyfts and this new mobility sector. And a lot of the challenges facing transit agencies were accelerated by 10, 15 years because of the pandemic. Now you've got to figure out, what kind of transit agency do you want to be? Are you going to just be focusing on your core ridership, right? And are you commuters, or are you going to be focusing on getting those people who are critical workers to and from? Transit agencies got hit hard, right? I mean, I think that a lot of people don't know, unless you're in this business, that transit is subsidized, right? It does not pay for itself. When you pay for that bus fare, when you go pay for your Metro card, Ashley, and you get on the Metro, those fares don't pay for the system, right? The infrastructure is expensive to implement, and it's expensive to operate and maintain and upkeep. And I think transit agencies in particular were hit very, very hard at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, a lot of the pandemic relief packages that have come out of Washington, D.C., both in the prior administration and in this administration, have focused on COVID recovery for transit agencies in particular. So some transit agencies that had to lay off folks are bringing those folks back now with some of these dollars. Some transit agencies are being able to sort of expand service options where they wouldn't have been able to before. But I think that the pandemic is really gonna make transit agencies have to think critically about what kind of transit agency are they going to be. Some of our clients are having really hard internal discussions about, is this line out into the furthest reaches that only gets a few riders worth it relative to running a line up and an additional route up and down the core central business district, right? And these are questions that now that you're going to be constrained, even further constrained on revenues and service delivery, how do you operate, especially when your buses are half full? So I think one of the things that we've seen that's been pretty innovative is that transit agencies are really trying to adopt new technologies to help things. So for example, all door boarding on buses, right? So rather than having to go in the front, everybody lines up and gets on. What if you could have an app, right, or a card that allows you to tap on and tap off, on the back doors of the bus, right, to split things out. So we're seeing transit agencies start to be a lot more innovative than I think they were forced to be in the past. But it's a big hit, and I think that once the relief packages end, and they will, a lot of these transit agencies are going to have to be really thoughtful about how to efficiently deliver the kinds of services that everybody needs.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points, David. I think, for a city like ours, where we've had a transit agency that has had a lot of ups and downs. At one point, we had the oldest fleet in the country. We had all the 1996 Olympic buses from Atlanta. Today, all of those are brand new electric or natural gas buses, thankfully. But, there's a lot of work on selling transit, right? And so, folk like the chamber and others being in our corner saying, hey, this is the move that we want to make, has been extremely helpful. I think the other piece, as director of a city, has been how to fix the first last mile aspects of people's opportunities to get to destinations. That if I can create better efficiency on the options that somebody has after they take or after they drive into a park and ride and then take another wise, then I've effectively made the pathway of people getting from point A to point B just as, or dare I say, more easier than it would be in their individual motor vehicle. And so I think a part of the attractiveness of transit, specifically in areas where you are trying to expand the tent of who a rider is, has been trying to address the first last mile piece. And so we're actually right in the midst of we've had bike share for a long time, but we're right in the midst of actually writing a new RFP that's focused around micromobility of all sorts. Obviously, being one of the first cities that had historic preservation, that's going to be different for us here than other places. For example, our council will not allow scooters. But how do we figure out that first last mile aspect? And what exactly does that look like? So if we are pushing for the opportunity with transit, we're making that decision as easy as possible, as accessible as possible, as affordable as possible. And so a lot of work to do there, but I think that tail end portion, I think, is going to play a major role, at least for us, in terms of how we move the needle on mode shift, which we desperately need to do.
And I think just to add another layer on top of that, it also depends on, the type of community that we have. So versus a San Francisco versus a Bakersfield, rural versus urban, or New York City, versus, Charleston, or, or Sacramento, for example. Certain areas have a lot of population that maybe support transit, but some others may not have that type of, or they're more spread out. And so some of the transit, agencies in rural areas are moving toward, a rideshare model, where, as more riders and customers are used to the Uber, Lyft, experience, it's like, and of course the reservation-based system has kind of been accelerated in the COVID world, to where I can ask for a ride and they can come get me and then take me to where I need to go, and there wouldn't be multiple stops along the way. So there's a lot of transition, and I think a lot of transit agencies and a lot of just transportation agencies in general are going to have to reevaluate their business model. As Keith mentioned, the safety of the workers and the workforce, those costs will probably remain for a little bit. Sanitation, cleaning the buses, cleaning the trains, all those costs are important, or those activities are important. So those costs have gone up as ridership has gone down. And so, how do you keep things functioning? Well, when you may be operating with additional costs, it's going to be a challenge in the short term, and probably in the near term, and in the long term too.
I don't want to skip over something that is Sunil and Vaughn highlighted that I think is important for conversation, right? I think context is always important. And as somebody who worked federally, coming locally to a city and seeing the sometimes the valley between the discourse around transportation and whether or not it's actually like the discourse is applicable in every situation. He highlighted rural communities and said transit with it. And I think that's an important point because a lot of times when transit is discussed, it's discussed in no shade, but in the kind of big city type of context. And that's not the only context that transit exists. We are one of those communities that, yes, we have an urban core, but we have a lot of rural. And so we have our Carter transit system, but we also have Tri-County Link, which is kind of a ride share model. And so, one of the things we've been doing is linking both of those systems together since it's the same our MPO operates both of those. So since our MPO is operating both of them, how are we making sure that the routes for Tri-County Link are designed in such a way where as they get into the urban core, they're able to link right into the Carter system as well and vice versa. So I think that was I don't want to skip over that point because I do think that the conversation around transit, yes, what happened with SFMTA was major and they were losing millions and millions of dollars. But that's not the only example of what transit looks like and how it's functioning in communities.
Thank you. And so I know, Keith, you mentioned a lot of now open spaces and a lot of people who are finding their cities a little bit more walkable. I know I have discovered a lot of trails within the Alexandria community with a lot of time on my hands. And it has been very enjoyable making sure that like my grocery stores or other small businesses are in walking distance. What changes have you seen in your communities? For instance, Vince, have you seen many of your constituents pushing for more, what is it called, bikeways? Are they pushing for more ride shares or bike shares? What does it look like in your cities?
Well, in because Kern County is situated in a kind of a high traffic area with the interstates, and most of the focus that we have in my community is on the roads. And so potholes are a big deal, fixing the potholes, making sure that we have lanes. Traffic congestion is probably is synonymous to California when we talk about, getting stuck on the freeway. So as we talked about, like the basics of maintaining our freeway system and building more lanes and building more freeways, that I know that's not in vogue, but we still need to do that because people drive. And whether it's electric or hydrogen or driverless cars or whatnot, I mean, they're on the road, and we need to address that. Tying back to the original conversation about quality of life, if you're in your car for hours upon hours trying to get to point A, point B, that's a very frustrating thing in your day-to-day commute. So like when we talk about like that type of investment, like how do we streamline the process so that it doesn't take 10, 15 years to build an additional lane somewhere? What can we shorten that to 2 or 3, or actually maybe 1 year? I would be ideal, so that the time value of money, the longer those projects go, the more expensive it is. And so that's always the big challenge. But there is a big push, in California, because people weren't traveling using trains and planes. They were driving more. They were driving to the natural forest to go camping. They're driving to different places. So we saw more travel changes to the car, back to the car. And so they're going to drive 8 hours to Tahoe or 2 hours to the coast instead of flying, from point A to point B. That may change as we get through this pandemic, but right now that was kind of the dynamic that we saw in California. And the other thing too, and maybe this is a question I would like to, for David and Keith, is that, as these large scale projects take time, technology is moving faster than it takes so by the time the projects get done, it may be obsolete. So, we're going to be investing in all these, big systems, but then will driverless cars and autonomous cars, will all those things make those projects, necessary? Electric planes, commercial space. I have Mojave, the spaceport in Kern County. I mean, we're going to have people going up into space. that would transform the kind of the airline industry. Imagine instead of going around the world, we just went up and down. So it would take 4 hours to get from Bakersfield to Paris or Bakersfield to China, or to Beijing, because you just go up and land wherever you want to go. I mean, all of those things could happen in our lifetime, and that would be extremely transformative.
I think to that point, Assemblyman Fong, it's exactly the right perspective, right? Because actually, you said how does it look in your community? I live in Denver, Colorado, and it's all of the above, right? It's expansion of roads, right, with active traffic management like express lanes. So to your point, Assemblyman Fong, traffic just like everywhere else diminished, but up to the mountains it was crazy, right? So even though the traffic got worse there for recreational traffic, and is that going to go back? Are people going to want to stay in their cars because they don't want a car share? And I think that for a long time you heard pushes away from, you can't build your way out of congestion, so additional lanes maybe aren't the answer. But I think the real answer is all of the above. It's everything from scooters, except maybe in Charleston, scooters to bike lanes, right? To bus rapid transit, to additional capacity on the highway and interstate network. And I think that reusing and adapting to the new realities, what you think they're going to be and what they are, is critical. So just north of you, Assemblyman Fong, in Merced County, California, the former Castle Air Force Base is being readapted into a connected and automated vehicle testing center, right? And that's a great example of what was a transportation function. It was an Air Force base, but it was an airport, right? And it's still functioning as an airport. And how do you adapt to what these new technologies and new communities doing? In Colorado, for example, Ashley, to your point, we're close behind California in terms of pushing electrification and electric vehicle adoption.
Yeah.
And so for us right now, it's a lot about how do you create the infrastructure to support widespread electrification and electric vehicle adoption, right? Because with a lot of the OEMs and manufacturers saying they're going to go all electric, I think that they still have to drive on the roads, right? And the roads still need to be able to contain that capacity. And so are there things that you can do with charging stations, mobility hubs, inductive charging? There's all kinds of cool technology out there that might not be ready for prime time today, but you've got to be ready for. And I think the challenge for policymakers like Assemblyman Fong and policy implementers like Keith is, how do you do both? How do you fix the potholes today, but also plan for 10 years in the future? It's something that thankfully we've got, great folks in elected office and who are appointed to sort of run these divisions to do this kind of work, but it's a tough challenge.
Yeah. And I'd be curious to know what Keith would say in terms of like as an implementer. It's like you also want flexibility. We don't want to pick winners and losers. I mean, there's a push for electrification, which I'm sure Keith is focused on. But what about hydrogen? What about other technologies that that may be more robust in the future? And if we're not diversifying, to use the finance term, diversifying our portfolio, and we're putting all our eggs in one basket and we're not doing something else. So as the state, right, we want to invest, but we also don't want to put our thumb on the scale on one or the other. And then we also don't want to stifle innovation, right? So technology is going to move faster than what any state or federal government can do. So, driverless cars, right? We don't want to stifle that. We want to encourage that. But, of course, you got to get through the DMV and you got to do the safety protocols and everything else. So how do we find that balance that exists?
Yeah, a lot of the varying different arguments and conversations that are happening in transportation, and actually, hopefully your head's not spinning, but getting back to your initial question, I think that's why I started my intro talking about transportation within the context of community building overall. Fact of the matter is that the generation of today, whether that's those coming into the workforce or those who are retiring, are preferring to live in communities where they have ease of access to their basic needs, right? Where I live right now, the home that we bought, I am 10-minute drive to my office. It's about 7 minutes to my son's school. We have access to about 4 different parks, including a zoo, within walking distance, grocery and otherwise. And so people's consciousness about where they live is playing into that. The problem with that is the affordability is trending higher for that, right? I'm in a particular bracket that allows me to afford that type of lifestyle. I would argue that that type of lifestyle shouldn't be just for those who can afford, right? And so that's where that transportation and housing affordability comes into play. And unfortunately, it's mired in this conundrum of defining what affordable housing is. But that being said, the trend of how and where people want to live has zoomed into having an ease and access of work, play, and otherwise. And because of that, right, those hubs, or as we call them, planning those activity centers, need multimodalism to function, right? People need to be able to get to those varying different areas. I would argue that COVID has expanded the footprint of what we define as a metropolitan area, because now I don't have to live in New York proper, right? I could live in Charleston, fly up to New York a couple of times, and then stay working from home in my place, right? And so I think that defining, I think, is important. But on the everyday level piece, as I said, I can't be doing my job properly if I'm not thinking consciously about who's accessing the public right of way, and is that safe and is that accessible. In our city, if you're taking transit, if you're riding a bike, if you're walking, you're not safe in our city yet. We're working on, right? Talk about Charleston being, #1 tourism city, but we are #1 in the state for bike ped death and injuries, and have been consistently for the last decade. 4 of the top 10 most dangerous corridors in our state are in my downtown. 43% of the people who get killed or injured are folk of color, right? And so as I think about accessibility, who is getting access and who is not, I have to be conscious of all those particulars about who has choice, like myself, and who doesn't have choice, right? And so they are taking up a mode of transportation that might be the one that's most accessible, the one that they can afford. And so it's incumbent on me to be thinking of both and when it comes to accessibility. And so the expansion of the express system, because of us having, the fastest growing port system in the country, is essential, right? By the same token, the fact that our Bridgeview neighborhood can now take this protected bike lane to our low line and access healthy food and get down to the medical district, is just as important to me in my eyes as I'm thinking about what implementation takes a look at. The other piece that I think is important, and Sylvia mentioned this twice, was the basics. And I think that's something that, like, as somebody who is one of those constituencies for the private industry that's constantly being called, like, check out our new product, et cetera, like, I am so squarely focused in on the basics. And what I have not seen enough of is technology that's helping me do the basics. Because the basics for me is that crosswalk. The basics for me is efficient signal systems. The basics for me is paving, is bike lanes, is transit accommodations, right? When I came into the city, less than 10% of our bus stops had any type of accommodation, shelter or bench. That's now at 25%, and we figured out how to increase funding directly towards transit accommodations, and even changed our zoning code where major developers can't come into our community and not be helping us meet our transportation goals. And so the basics for me are essential. I'll give you one example. A company, I don't know the name companies, a company decided to drop 250 scooters in our downtown. Didn't give us any notice of it. And it created a crazy uproar and otherwise. And I would argue if they had approached it differently, we actually might have scooters right now. But that's beyond the point. When you log on to that app, the first 2 instructions that that app tells you is to put on your helmet and use a bike lane. Really good instructions. What you're supposed to do if in your downtown corridor, those lanes don't exist, right? That's the stuff that I'm trying to work on, right? And so if you're going to help me with that, then yeah, let's pull those 2 things together and make that happen, right? If you're going to help me with the mode shift aspects and what that looks like, let's figure that out, and let's figure out how to make that happen, right? Are you going to help me address this first last mile? Cool, let's figure that out. You're going to help me address the safety concern so that people aren't so scared to walk across the street, and let's figure that out. And I think, maybe that's because when somebody dies on the street, it comes to me, right? Maybe it's because I have to be the one standing out there and talking to the. But I think that the what some would label as the basics to me is where the innovation lies, and if we can get that right, that opens the door for the other pieces.
And
That's my soapbox.
yeah, no, that's important. And safety, we haven't talked about that. We talked about innovation technology, but safety is critical. I mean, that's the whole point of, we got to get people to point A to point B safely. But I also want to highlight that something important that Keith talked about, which is the affordability and accessibility. You know, if you can't afford to live in the downtown core, then you're pushing people to move out to somewhere more affordable. Now, in Kern County and Central Valley, we're relatively affordable compared to the rest of the state of California. But now you're forcing people to drive further. And if you're a family that's struggling to make ends meet, or just struggling to afford to live and work where you are, and you're now forced to drive further, move further away to get a house or an apartment, you know, that's where the housing and the quality of life and the transportation worlds collide, and we got to be sensitive to that. And of course, if you're probably struggling to make ends meet, you probably don't have a very expensive car. You don't have probably the and so as a state, or as policymakers, right? You know, are we forcing people to buy a car that, you know, is more expensive, and they may not be able to do that? And that's always a challenge too. And then of course you got the gas tax and everything else in the dynamics. That's extremely regressive, right? So if you are forcing people to move further away, but then they're traveling more and they've got an older car, so they're paying more in taxes, and they're also paying in terms of getting further out and being on the road longer. And then of course, if you're shifting everything to another type of vehicle, like a hydrogen or electric car, well, those cars don't pay a gas tax, right? So then you've got this weird dynamic where you're pushing everyone, and then your revenue stream goes down. So there's a lot of questions out there.
Assemblyman Fong, I think the funding of transportation is something we haven't talked about, that I'd like to pick up on it if I can, just because it's critical, right? Infrastructure is expensive to put into the ground. It's expensive to maintain. It's expensive to operate. And as you noted, gas tax is regressive. And as cars get more efficient, you're getting less for your dollar every time you fill up at the pump. That's how most of our transportation network is funded, at least on the highway side. And as you know, you've got all these new technologies, and how are we going to even, it's a question, right? Charge those technologies, those fees, in order to fill the funding gap, right? Because I think that what we've seen across the country over the course of the last few cycles is that states and localities have gone to self-help, right? Local sales taxes to support transportation, local gas tax increases to support transportation, because you haven't had a federal gas tax increase in about almost 20 years. It's been a while. And I think that the funding of transportation is something that really folks need to think a little bit more about, because it's like you said, you show up at the bus, you get on, you get to where your destination is. If it works great, you don't think twice about it. But if your bus turns into an electric vehicle, right, and now you're not filling it up with gas and there's no gas tax, it's revenue, how do you fill those coffers, right, both at the state and federal level, to make sure that you can continue to reinvest in transportation? One of the things some of our clients have been doing is really taking a close look at that and saying, okay, how much is our gas tax leverage dropping every year? When are we going to see whatever electric vehicles hockey stick, or first last mile delivery, right? The sort of micro delivery around the cities. That's a huge new burden on infrastructure. You've got hundreds and thousands of Amazon trucks and DoorDash delivery on your infrastructure that you didn't have before. That causes wear and tear. So is it reasonable to impose a fee on that kind of service or on those types of miles? So I think one of the things we've seen a lot of our clients talking about and considering, right, is modeling, okay, well, what if you move to some sort of road usage charge or vehicles miles traveled, or a fee-based system where an electric vehicle, you get an extra fee on top of the registration fee that you pay. So I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit about what you think in terms of funding transportation, because as we talk to our clients, it's a critical piece, and there isn't an answer yet. And as we look out 10 years and we're doing this work, talking to them, modeling, sort of trying to be strategic, there's this interim period that until we get to what the new normal is, revenues are going to continue to decrease. So I'd love to hear, Keith and Assemblyman Fong, your thoughts on the funding of transportation infrastructure, because I know for Keith, for your department, you're counting every penny, I'm sure, and Assemblyman Fong, you're trying to figure out how you can allocate those dollars appropriately. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, man, you're getting into the nerdy part of transportation. I'm down for it though. I'm down for it. But
I hope everybody else is.
let me give context, because I think this part is important too. And David, you know this, and so Yvonne, knowing the state level stuff, but the variation of the complexities of how transportation gets done from state to state, city to city is so vast. So just to give an inclination, so y'all hear where I'm coming from. So South Carolina is fourth in the country in the amount of roads that are owned by the state DOT. So even some of my minor roads, or I'll put it in this way, there's some streets where I have to ask the state DOT permission to put up a stop sign, right? Then from a funding standpoint, yes, you have the gas tax that comes down and otherwise, but we've passed sales taxes, especially in Charleston County. We've passed two, one in 2004 and one in 2016. By state stipulation, all of that sales tax funding actually sits at our counties. So even though City of Charleston makes the vast majority of that sales tax, I have to go to another entity to make requests for different type of infrastructure that we want to see happen, right? And so that's an interesting dynamic, and an MPO kind of functions as the convener of all. And so that's an interesting dynamic when you're talking about getting something done. Like I had a constituency that just asked about changing a two-way street to one-way street, and I pinged the district engineer for the state DOT for my region just to kind of get his vibe. Like those are the type of conversations I have to be able to get basics done in the city. And so I think one of the things that's going to be interesting, and I'm wondering if Secretary Buttigieg will be focused in on that with him having led a city, is in thinking about the funding, David, are we talking about funding that's coming from the federal government directly to states and then down from there? Or are we talking about funding that's going to be in some ways direct to municipality? Right? There's a lot of varying different things that we're partnering with our state DOT on that we're excited about. But there's a number of things that the city is stepping up to do that we know is going to have a high price tag down the line. We're one of those coastal cities that has over 80 days of sunny day flooding, which translation means we could just have a high tide and have water in our streets. And so we're one of those coastal cities that's literally right now talking with the Army Corps of Engineers of whether or not there should be some sort of barrier, whether natural or physical, around our peninsula. That's multi billions of dollars that we're not necessarily going to be getting money from the state for to execute. What exactly does that look like, and how do we talk about that? And what should that function be? Our state DOT has been thinking about buyback programs for some of their infrastructure, because a state like ours being fourth in the country amount of infrastructure that's owned by the state DOT is kind of crazy to think about when we have nothing close to top 10 population density. So should we have a program kind of like Louisiana, where municipalities go to the state DOT with varying different pieces of infrastructure they're willing to take ownership of? The state DOT brings it up to a state of good repair and then hands it up with a 40-year buyout maintenance check, and that entity takes that piece of infrastructure back. Like, I think those are some of the nuances of not just, hey, where does this funding come from, but actually how does that get spent? Who is that directly to, and what exactly does that look like? I think those nuances have to be figured out as well, and it's really going to vary a lot. But I think that piece is important, because a municipality like ours, we're willing to step up, but we also recognize in order for us to step up, we have to have the funding mechanisms for it. And instead of just a top-down situation, can it be direct?
Yeah. So it's an interesting dynamics that have Keith and I juxtaposed next to each other in terms of he's implementing funding that comes from the state and from the federal government, and we're trying to juggle it. I will speak from a California perspective. Like the budgets reflect priorities, right? So as we talked about too, we would always say transportation is a critical state, local government function to maintain the roads and transit and everything else. But where is it in the level of everything else? So I haven't looked at the budget in South Carolina to know where transportation is, but transportation isn't in the top 10 in terms of budget items in California. And I'm the vice chair of the budget committee too, also being the vice chair of the transportation committee. So if we go out to the public and say, all right, name your top 5 priorities that the state of California should fund: healthcare, education, all public safety probably, and then probably up there is transportation. But transportation is probably like lucky to be like 50th in terms of the priorities. So do we fund it at an appropriate level? And of course, is it going to what it's going to be supposed to be used for? When we had this big fight in California a couple of years ago on the gas tax, the amount of diversions, and like we had highway money that wasn't going to highways. We had road money that wasn't going to roads. And so that becomes a really a difficult conversation. It's like, wait, you can't ask Californians or riders to pay more if they're getting less. And that's always the challenge. I would say that the general fund should be used for transportation, more of it. I think that I had a proposal to say that if you bought a car, that the sales tax portion of that purchase should go to transportation. Like if you're going to buy a car, you're probably going to use it on the road. So you should take that portion of that and dedicate it to transportation. I think that we have a program, Cap and Trade in California. That should be used for transit, right? If your concern is carbon and reducing carbon emissions, and you encouraging people to ride a bus and take transit, well, it makes sense. There's a nexus there. So we have to look at the budget holistically. I think that we do. The Highway Trust Fund and the federal government has the same dynamics that every state does. The federal gas tax is regressive as much as the state gas taxes are. Encouraging public-private partnerships, new ways to fund infrastructure projects, making sure that infrastructure projects are done cheaper in some ways is a big thing. I probably would love to hear Keith's ideas in terms of how to budget constraints and how to deliver more with less. That's the big challenge, is how do you fund roads and infrastructure? And then of course, with everything happening, a lot of the private sector is doing more. The biggest disruptors in transportation haven't been from the government. Uber, Lyft, scooters, ride share. You've got new fleets. All of those things that are happening that are changing the transportation space. Like that's not from the government, and so the government has an ability to kind of ensure safety, but also to figure out how to put the pieces of the puzzle together.
Let me bring something up that I think is important, and my background is in policy, so that's the lens that I'm constantly looking at. How do we get to the funding part, David? I think there is policy, especially on the local level, around zoning and otherwise, that gives us some leverage as well. And I'll give a quick example on the local. Interestingly enough, despite the pandemic, we just heard about it this week, our expansion, especially for office space in our downtown, has skyrocketed, even though around the country, for whatever reason, it's been on a downturn. I think a lot of it is in anticipation of what's going to happen, right? We just, our aviation board, maybe just saw that our March numbers potentially might meet, in terms of boardings, might meet our 2019 March numbers.
Wow.
And so, stuff is happening. So people want to develop in our city. People want to bring stuff, residential, hotels, commercial, office, whatever that is. I would argue if you want to be in our city and develop in our city, then you need to help meet our city's goals. And so to your point about like, how do we find ways to still get to where we need to? We've been maximizing some of our ordinances and zoning code for what's stipulated within the development process of what these different entities need to bring to the table to help us get there, right? So example-wise, every major development in our city has to do with traffic studies. And that traffic study is dictating what potential mitigations they might need to do for what they're introducing to that particular area of the community, right? And historically, many of those mitigations, which are still good mitigations to do, have been primarily focused on basic right-of-way things and otherwise stipulated by the state. We amended our code regarding that process to say that still on the same measurements, same engineering measurements that any consultant would look at for dictating their traffic study, that if they meet certain thresholds, not only will they have to do those basic mitigations that the state DOT stipulates, but part of their mitigation is going to have to include transit accommodations, or they don't get their CO. And so we're making it mandatory that we welcome you, but you're going to help us meet our goals too. That's costing me nothing, right? And so a small example, but just a way in which we can figure out ways to get to, again, the basics, get to the things that are necessary to make people's livability better, but hold all of us accountable, right, to participating in that.
Well, when we talk about transportation, it's like whether it's financing or just broadly how we get people around and have goods and products around. You know, states are laboratories of innovation, but cities are as well. And so, especially in the transportation space, we should learn from different jurisdictions and how they do things.
We have about 3 minutes left. David, how are you trying to get your clients to look forward? What kind of advice are you giving to them as they look for a post-COVID era?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I'll keep it short. I mean, really our big discussion with them right now is to take a step back, right? And think strategically, right? We like to talk to our clients about, it's not about this project, right? Not about this bike lane. It's about your whole program, right? From beginning to end, from soup to nuts. How does this bike lane fit in with your goals and priorities? How does it feed into the bus that person's going to park their bike next to and hop on, and that bus that then goes to the airport, right? It's really systemic. So we try to talk about this capital programming excellence framework, right? So that you can think about it strategically, so that you're not being short-sighted, right? You do have to do the things that need to get done, but really taking a big picture, holistic view of it. And I think we've talked about that here today. The conversation with Keith and Assemblyman Fong has really borne that out. It's about not just the bike or the road or the bus, but it's about so much more. And I think those clients are the ones who are really positioning themselves to be successful coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you. And my last question is open to anyone. As we see more people pivoting towards using their own cars for safety measures, or because they just feel a little, I guess we say safer with COVID being around, how are you encouraging people to continue using public transportation now and as we go back towards working in brick and mortar buildings and less remote?
I mean, Keith might be the expert here. You know, in terms of just getting folks to feel safe traveling. I mean, that comes with all those protocols, right? It's the sanitation, it's the PPE, it's ensuring you know, the transit and the drivers are vaccinated as much as possible, including the population as a whole, ensuring that both sides have access to vaccines. I think that's probably the big thing is encourage. I mean, from a safety standpoint, and getting people to feel that everything's being done to keep both the workers and the travelers as safe as possible. Keith.
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. I think we have to make sure we're doing the right thing about proving to the general public that this is a viable option for them, right? And I think that, you know, obviously the pandemic makes that all the more harder, but I think that's a big part of it, right? The efficiency of the system, how it connects them, what it connects them to, and others are big parts of why somebody would take Metro than not. You know, when I was in DC, you know, our house over in the 7th Ward is an 8-minute walk to Minnesota Ave Station, right? And, you know, it was about, you know, 15, 17 minutes me to get a Navy Yard and get to USDOT. So there was no, like it made sense. I got off the train and I was at my job, right? And so the efficiency of doing that versus taking 295, actually, like there's no comparison. I'm not getting stuck in that on Benning Road, right? And so I think a part of it is also making the case of why that option makes sense, why that directly connects people to their basic needs, and otherwise, and along with all the things that, you know, Assemblyman Vaughn mentioned about the safety protocols and otherwise, right? I think choice is about trust. You know, folk need to be able to trust that if I make this choice, I'm going to be safe, and it's folk like my job to make sure that when that choice is made or option is taken, that they're as safe as possible. So, all of it is building trust. It's almost like a relationship. So, there's no guarantees in it, but there's work that has to be done there.
Certainly. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us and doing the work that you do. You keep our cities and communities connected. So I just really appreciate you joining us today. To our audience, I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation, and we enjoy putting on works like these and town halls like these to educate you all, and to get you connected to some of the work that our alumni do all around this country. And so as our exchange work transitions to virtual engagement during this COVID-19 pandemic, it's vital that we measure the impact and the effects of our virtual town hall series for our funding partners. To do this, we ask that our audience members complete a brief exit survey. The Zoom attendees can view the survey link on the post attendee screen and also can receive it in an email tomorrow. Viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube can find the survey link in the video description on the respective platform. Thank you in advance for taking the survey and helping us measure the impact of our programming during this time. So I want to thank you, our audience, again, and thank our panelists. We, of course, love engaging with you and hope that you'll be able to travel with us in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Bye.